今天是2025年9月23号。今天来读这个《China Economy》这本书2020年的修正版。我简略的看了一下，我觉得比较有意思的内容呢，不是特别多。那是今天想讲的第一部分，就是概括一下这个习近平时代的中国外交政策的改变。第二个想讲的就是回顾一下这个美国对华政策的一个历史吧。那我们可以先简略的来看一下这个习近平的政策这个总结的还是挺有意思的，就是13年之后呢，政策的变化主要有3点那第一个就是在南海嘛这个大家都有感受到中国的那些海警船经常去喷菲律宾的渔船，这都不是什么大的新闻了，据说还死过人就是说中国在南海的那些岛屿上呢当然除了这个军舰上的巡逻之外，中国在那些南海的岛屿上也建了很多军事基地，所以让菲律宾越南这样的国家很不爽，然后他们就在那种军事峰会上，亚洲军事峰会上各种喷中国，这个基本上大家都知道的第二个就是他想就是一个所谓的军民融合，或者是什么军工复合体吧，这也是为什么 Trump 在疫情期间不让妻子的学生入境的一个原因，就是习近平 announced 的这个 military civil fusion 所谓的军民融合计划嘛。一些大学就开始做一些军工项目。当然了，他这里指出了，其实美国就是一个 military industrial complex， 那 MIT军工的项目简直不要太多，那军队的小火车就在那是相当的嚣张，在 Cambridge 跑的时候这第3点呢，就是一带一路想要说是build 中国的这种international investment， 或者说是 infrastructure diplomacy。当然他这里指出的一点就是说，这个他认为还是自然的，就是中国的经济这个实力上去了以后，肯定会去寻求一些政治实力上的提升。然后他还特别指出，其实中国在60、70年代的时候是更加 crazy 的，就是想 actively support insurrections and revolutions around the world， 就是支持这种红色革命。大家也应该知道这个不是缅甸，柬埔寨的那个红色高棉那个王朝简直不要再 crazy。这个 YouTube 上有很多人讲过，大家可以去看看那个比文化大革命还要疯狂的那么一个时代，就是在柬埔寨的那么一个时代。同时他也指出其实美国更愿意 intervene in other countries 就是内政吧，就是从 Cold War 开始，美国总共颠覆了别的国家的政权72次中国并没有这么做那就是说只是说中国现在的这个政治或者是说在国际舞台的诉求都是跟自己的经济实力呢相符合的，这是他的一个观点。当然我觉得这样的诉求呢也让美国或者说是西方的一些国家非常不爽了那我们接下来就来回顾一下这个美国对华的政策的一个改变吧。好， why has U.S. policy toward China shifted? As our discussion shows, China's economic rise has enabled the country to exert much more political influence around the world than in the past. And under Xi Jinping's leadership, it has become far more assertive in promoting its interests and values. But China's ability to alter the global rules of the game is constrained by its economic dependence on international trade and investment flows to support its technological development. 所以这一点就很有意思其实他这一点就是说，其实中国毕竟有点既要又要了，就是你的经济发展基本上是来自于跟西方比较发达的国家做贸易，或者说西方比较发达国家的投资，然后这个时候你还想是吧跟人家唱反调，有点既要又要了。 Another deterrent is that many other countries in Asia maintain formal alliances or less formal security arrangements with the United States, which they are reluctant to abandon. China's attempt to remake global infrastructure via the Belt and Road Initiative has hit capacity constraints and political resistance. So while China's political clout is clearly growing, it is still rather less than might be impelled by its status as the world's second biggest economy and biggest trade nation with a 15% share of global GDP. Even so, China's rising economic and political status has set off alarm bells in Washington and has led to a dramatic change in the United States' stance toward China. In order to assess China's future role in the global order, we need first to understand why the United States has decided to change its China policy and what impact this shift is likely to have. In 1979, the United States normalized diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China, ending a period of nearly 3 decades during which Washington did not recognize the CCP regime. The initial rationale for rapprochement from the U.S. side was the desire to enlist China as a counterweight to the Soviet Union during the Cold War. China, which had effectively broken with its fellow communist regime by 1960, was also looking for a counterweight to Soviet power. After Deng Xiaoping assumed control of China in 1978, it was also looking for a partner to aid its economic development. The generally constructive relationship between the two countries was tested first by the Tiananmen Square demonstrations and the subsequent crackdown of 1989, which led to the imposition of economic sanctions by the United States and then by the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, which eliminated the original basis of this unlikely partnership between two large powers with sharply opposed political and ideological systems. 所以那时候还是很艰难的。首先是89年的学潮，就是让美国也意识到这中国还是一个 authoritarian 的 state， 然后再加上 Soviet Union 91年 break up 了，那你这个美国利用中国牵制苏联的这个意图也就不存在了嘛。Through the 1990s, frictions were persistent, especially given that under U.S. law, Chinese eligibility for most favored nation trading status depended on an annual certification by the White House that China's human rights conditions were within acceptable bounds. Yet, during this period, a consensus crystallized in Washington around a policy stance usually referred to as constructive engagement. This policy held that it was in the United States' national interest not to treat China as an adversary, but instead to foster its economic rise and encourage its integration with global economic institutions and with the U.S. economy. 其实 basically 就是美国的资本家或者叫世界的资本家想赚钱，想利用中国的 cheap labor force 赚钱。The economic rationale for this policy was straightforward. China represented a huge potential market for U.S. firms. The central security rationale was not, as it is sometimes now portrayed, that economic growth and integration would inexorably cause China to evolve into a liberal democracy. Rather, it was the calculation that, given that China's political system was likely to remain divergent from the norms of the industrialized democracies, greater economic integration would, 1, constrain China to play by the rules of the global economic game, thereby becoming a broadly constructive force rather than a disruptive one, as the Soviet Union had been. And 2, reduce the risk of U.S.-China frictions escalating into armed conflict by raising the cost of such a conflict. A major achievement of this policy was China's accession to the WTO in December 2001, after 15 years of intensive negotiations. Up until the election of Donald Trump in 2016, the idea of constructive engagement was the basic framework for U.S. relations with China. The Trump administration adopted a more adversarial stance in which China was formally identified as a strategic competitor. In addition, in early 2018, it launched a trade war, which by late 2019 had resulted in special tariffs of 10 to 25% being imposed on some 375 billion in Chinese imports to the United States. In August 2018, Congress also passed legislation tightening controls on the export of critical technologies, a law whose main target was China. In retaliation, China imposed tariffs on over 100 billion in imports from the United States and also restricted imports of many agricultural products, notably soybeans. The trade war and the labeling of China as a strategic competitor are related but distinct policies. The trade war was driven personally by Trump, who has a long history as an economic nationalist and advocate of managed trade. Although China was the biggest target, it was by no means the only one. Massive tariffs on imported steel and aluminum mainly targeted countries allied or aligned with the United States, including Canada, Brazil, Japan, and Germany. Trump also used the tariff threats to renegotiate a long-standing free trade agreement in Canada and Mexico. The strategic competitor narrative was driven mainly by bureaucrats in the National Security Council and the Defense Department. While Trump went along with it, he has shown little interest in actively promoting this approach. Across the political spectrum in Washington, the strategic competitor idea commands broad, if often qualified, support, whereas support for the trade war is narrower. Several reasons account for the shift from constructive engagement to a more adversarial stance. One is simply that China has become a lot bigger and more powerful and seems on its way not only to surpassing the United States as the world's biggest economy, but also acting as a peer competitor in the economic, technological, and military spheres. Another reason was the changes in Chinese policy under Xi Jinping after 2013. The Made in China 2025 industrial policy was seen as an effort to subsidize Chinese firms so that they could displace American competitors in a host of high-value technology-intensive fields. The military-civil fusion program was seen as an effort to ensure that any technological gains in the commercial sector would translate into a strengthening of China's military capabilities. The build-up of artificial island bases in the South China Sea was viewed as a signal of China's intent to displace the United States as a main power in maritime Asia. And the Belt and Road Initiative was regarded as an effort to build up China's geopolitical influence throughout the world. Moreover, Xi's centralization of power, increasingly authoritarian tactics, and expansion of the CCP's role in all aspects of society reduced the hopes that China's political system might converge with the democratic norms of the United States and its allies. These security-related concerns dovetailed with economic discontents, which played a role in Trump's election. Although China's rise as a manufacturing power was probably on net beneficial for the U.S. economy, since it enabled U.S. companies to increase efficiencies by lowering production costs and reduce the prices of a wide range of consumer and industrial goods. These benefits came at the cost of an accelerated decline in U.S. manufacturing employment, with job losses concentrated in the traditional Midwest industrial heartland. The U.S. political system did a poor job of protecting workers hurt by competition from low labor cost countries, notably but not exclusively China, and from automation. One important macroeconomic consequence was that the benefit of China's rise flowed disproportionately to owners of capital, whose share of national income rose at the expense of workers. The rising sense that many communities were being left behind and that China's growth came not through fair competition but by cheating on the rules of WTO boosted support for the protectionist and economic nationalist policies that Trump championed. At the elite level, there was rising concern that the transfer of manufacturing capacity from the United States to China would not only slow down the United States' economic growth, but also harm its national security by reducing the country's ability to produce industrial goods needed for national defense. 这一点很重要呀。很多人以为产业就是美国的产业空心化，主要是 hurt 了那些红脖子们，所以说那些红脖子们 vote for Trump。但实际上，美国的精英阶级对这个也是有 concern 的，主要是 national security 的 concern， 就是说 concern 中国造武器的能力超过美国。An active debate has arisen among the U.S. policy elite about what the appropriate posture toward China should be in the coming decades. Most likely, this debate will take several years to resolve because of the complexity of the U.S.-China relationship and the nature of the interests at stake. Simplifying greatly, we may conceptualize this debate as pitting three broad perspectives against one another. One is a national security-oriented view that China's rise is at the very least a serious challenge to U.S. global leadership and to specific U.S. security interests in Asia, and perhaps even an existential threat to the U.S.-led international order. Allied to this view is the economic nationalist perspective that American prosperity is threatened by a predatory China and that the interdependence of the two economies should be reduced. The second view, grounded in economics and business, sees U.S.-China economic interdependence as beneficial for both commercial and security reasons. From this vantage point, China's enormous and fast-growing market is an important source of future growth for American firms. The ability of U.S. firms to remain at the global technological leading edge will depend on their ability to participate in this market. Taking advantage of the profits, human resources, and production efficiencies that it offers, the scope of U.S. business engagement with China is already so huge that it cannot be unwound or scaled back without inflicting great damage on the U.S. economy. Since 2015, China has accounted for around 16% of total U.S. trade, comparable to Japan in the 1980s and far greater than the trading relationship with the Soviet Union and its successor states. And U.S. companies have a large presence in China's domestic market in 2017. About 70,000 U.S. companies had some kind of operation in China and generated $544 billion in sales there, more than triple the value of the U.S. exports to China. Okay. The third perspective focuses on the increasingly illiberal drift of China's political system. In this values-based view, China's increasingly authoritarian and repressive policies at home and mounting efforts to influence public opinion and silence criticism of the CCP regime abroad represent serious threats to the core values not just of the United States but of the liberal world order more generally. A new American strategy toward China will have to accommodate, at least to some degree, the nation's national security, commercial, and values interests. Crafting such a policy will be no easy task. U.S. policy toward China in the coming years will focus more on competition and conflict and less on cooperation and collaboration than was the case before 2016, but efforts to launch a full-on strategy of containment, similar to the U.S. strategy against the Soviet Union during the Cold War, will be blunted by economic interests, which can mount a credible argument that continued economic interdependence is not only beneficial for the United States commercially, but also serves the long-run security interests by constraining China's ability to fundamentally change the global economic order and by raising the cost of armed conflict. 那今天就读到这儿了，大家拜拜。